This is a PowerPoint regarding social learning theory, and we are going to be exploring, as it says on the specification, some key areas of how we learn through, as you can see, key terms such as imitation, identification, modelling, vicarious reinforcement, mediation processes, and some key research by Bandura. Now, this view, the social learning theory view, is risen from our previous two explanations of learning and is called new or neo behaviorism. So, previously, we mentioned learning by association, and that's classical conditioning. We also mentioned learning by reinforcement, and that is operant conditioning. But Bandura believed that learning may occur through the influence of others, and particularly through imitation or copying, or modelling, that is, looking at the behaviour of others on which to base our own behaviour. Now, key to this idea is modelling. We need to be able to explain a little bit more detail on that. So this is the idea of an attitude or a behaviour that you're going to copy from someone else. And that can either be live or it can be what we call symbolic. So that could be a character that you might, for example, see on a TV programme or a film, and you later, again, may copy, observe, and then copy that behaviour. Imitation itself is the idea of displaying or copying those attitudes and behaviours of people that are important to you. And those could be parents, those could be significant others, those could be siblings, people in the media, those that you are keen to identify with. When you are able to have a little look at this clip, Children See, Children Do, just click on where it says that. This takes you to an Australian advert. It's a little bit old, a little bit grainy, but it's a good idea about children see and children do in terms of this approach to learning. And maybe have a think yourself about why role models are really important. Now, why is it that some behaviour is imitated and others might not be? Work on this is developing in a few moments when we talk about Bandura and his research, but some of the ideas that we need to mention here are important. So really important determinants are the characteristics of the model themselves. That could be whether in fact they're the same sex as yourself. In terms of the observer of behaviour, can you actually carry out the behaviour, your ability? Is it something you can copy and complete yourself? And also the observed consequences of that behaviour. Now, in your booklets, you will see on page 27 at the top of the page, there is a box where you're asked to put some notes from the textbook under the headings of modelling and imitation. So do use that information in your textbook on 128, but also these last two slides to fill that in. What you'll also see on there is that there are some further explanations, and this comes under what we call mediational processes. Come on to that in a moment. But before that, we'll mention what's called identification and vicarious reinforcement. Now, again, have a look at the notes in the textbook and make sure you fill in the box on page 27. Identification is the extent to which an individual kind of relates to the model that they're observing and feels that they're similar or different. So again, we mentioned before, same-sex models can be important in that. And vicarious, rather than actually being rewarded, it might be that you learn the consequences of actions that you don't directly experience. Maybe you're seeing that directly through the behaviour of others. And that's another area that you need to make sure you've got a good definition in your booklet. Now, mediational processes, let's have a little look at that. This again takes us a step forward from what we've looked at in our previous views of how we learn classical and operant conditioning to actually acknowledge the role of thinking. And in a mediational, the role of mediational processes says there's actual changes in thinking that are associated with learning. So first of all, we've got attention. You've got to notice what the behaviour is. You've got to remember that, or retain it, retention. You've also got to be able to perform the action or reproduce it. And finally, you've got to want to be able to have a go at that behaviour, or you're motivated. And that again may be related to whether there's some reward or some punishment that follows the behaviour. And the thinking in here is that this mental representation of behaviour and the consequences of that behaviour will determine whether or not you're likely to copy that behaviour in the future. When you're ready, try and cover up your notes. You've got the 4 mediation processes on the previous slide. See if you can remember which is which on there. Give you a chance to have a little look through and maybe just test yourself. That's always a good thing to do. Okay, when we're ready, we're going to move on to some key questions. So do make sure you've had a good read through of the sections of the textbook, and that's 128, before you have a go at these couple of questions. Here we go. So this is a 4 mark question, and it's a bit of a STEM. So there's a little bit of info given to you, and then you're asked to apply your knowledge to the question. So here we go. Bradley has just started to play snooker and is keen to play well. He watches carefully when his partner takes a difficult shot, then tries to copy the same shot. He thinks about how his partner was holding the snooker cue and whether he can do the same. Social learning theorists refer to the role of mediational processes in learning. Referring to Bradley's experience, explain the role of mediational processes in learning. It would be a really good idea not to go forward onto the mark scheme and the content, but actually just to bullet point for yourself. Give yourself, say, 4 bullet points to go with the 4 marks. Think about what aspects of mediational processes you might describe, but more importantly, the question is about referring to Bradley's experiences and thinking about his playing of snooker. Okay, so have a go before you move on to the next slide. Test yourselves if you can. Always really good way step forward to do that. And there is the mark scheme. We're not going to go through it in any great depth, but what you can see are the examples that we've just talked about. So, attention, motivation, retention, etc. And some ideas about how Bradley might be showing examples of those. So paying attention to the actions of the person he wants to copy, he watches them carefully. So we were trying to weave the psychology into the description of Bradley. Another example, he pays attention to the action of the person he wants to copy, but he also has to remember the action. He has to think about how he's going to hold the cue and actually carry that out, and considering whether he can actually do the same. So there's some other examples of mediational processes linked to Bradley in that answer. Now, Bandura is the key study here. You'll see on page 27 of your booklet that Bandura is some details of the Bobo doll study are mentioned in your textbook on 128. The key here is procedures and findings, but be really careful that you don't go overboard on your description here. Please have a look at the clip. It's about 9 minutes, so do stop it and make sure you've got some notes on, as it says there, procedures. So how was the research carried out, and also the findings, what was found in the study. And try and pick out some key details. We'll talk about the extension task and having a look at the Bandura article in a little while. Okay. Further to that, we have got another application question. So here we have got another STEM. Psychologist is carrying out a study of social learning theory, of social learning. As part of the procedure, he showed children aged 4 to 5 years a film of a 4-year-old boy stroking a puppy. Whilst the children watched the film, the psychologist commented on how the boy was. After the children had watched the film, the psychologist brought a puppy into the room and watched to see how the children behaved with the puppy. Sort of 2 elements to this question. We've got our kind of knowledge, so outline what's meant by social learning theory, and then the second part, explain how social learning might have occurred in the procedure above. Now, this is slightly different in terms of the procedure of showing the children the film. What was the film demonstrating? What was the modelling of behaviour there? And then what was the imitation that we saw the children observed while the children observed? So again, really, really good idea to test yourself on this. Either go back to your notes and use them, or if you can do it without even referring to those, brilliant. We're trying to get some key terms in here. 6 marks, so try and sort of 2 elements to the question, some identification of key elements of social learning theory, some application to this study here. Okay, and the mark scheme will follow. The mark scheme then, folks, takes us through the outline for AO1, which is just our kind of explanation or outlining of social learning theory. That's going to be worth the smaller number of marks here. It is really the explanation and the link to the procedure that's going to get the more significant marks. So as we've got at the top of the page, your AO1 skill, your knowledge or understanding, the key or command word here is outline. We've got observation, we've got imitation, copying or modelling, and we've got the key things we mentioned previously about vicarious reinforcement. And if you wanted to, you could talk about cognition or thinking or mediational processes within that, but you don't have to. And then you have the application itself to the film of the boy and the puppy. And we've got lots of examples there. I won't read through all of them, but lots of examples of ways certainly don't need to include all of those bullet points. One or two of those is going to get you right up there into your top marks. So have a little look at the description underneath from the mark scheme. If you have had a go at either planning or writing it, you can maybe assess how you've got on with that. Now, if we move away from our knowledge of social learning theory to a commentary on it, and I would suggest before you start having a look at this, you have a really good read through of the textbook on 129, where there's some very useful evaluation points. There is a grid on page 28 in your booklet to go with this. And the grid allows you to pick out some comments. You need to be clear which of these comments relate to strengths or things that are useful about SLT, and which could be argued to be challenges or weaknesses of social learning theory. And where possible, we're now trying to kind of move towards producing commentary and evaluation that is a little bit more structured. So where I talk about paragraphing using a top or for some members of staff, it might be point. Then comes your kind of body of your comment there, your research, your theory that goes with your strength or weakness. And your tail might be your kind of conclusion, if you like. Why does this show? Now, all that we have got in this section are some examples for you to use. You don't need to make a note of these, but what will be really helpful is maybe you could pick out some elements that you can use in your grid on page 28. Now, I'm not going to kind of read each of those, but I will pick out some elements that go with what we've just said on the previous page. So in terms of AO3 or evaluation commentary, we might find that the structure is helpful to begin with identifying the point that you're making. And in this case, it's a strength of learning theory. Then we might want to explain a little bit more detail and give maybe some details of research that goes with it. In this case, as you can see in the green, there is support from research by Ulrich, and then just a comment on the findings and why it's relevant. And then at the end, bringing it back to the question, why is this a strength? This matters because one of a number of phrases that you might see written as examples of evaluation, and obviously try maybe and test out some of your own ideas of how to do that. But bringing it back to the question, this is a strength because. Further examples for you to have a little look at. So another strength of some research there to go alongside that, which you'll see in your textbook in a bit more depth. And then maybe this time you could have a go at this matters or this shows, this highlights the value of social learning theory, whichever kind of way you want to draw it to a conclusion, and maybe have a go at tidying that one up yourself. Now, as we draw to a conclusion, we have got some further comments on SLT. So here's a comment about the notion that maybe one single explanation is a little bit narrow, and the cause of delinquency could be more than social learning theory. It could be a variety of previous determinants or things that happen to people. But what we need to try and do is put that into a framework. And I'm going to come back to some issues, debates, and approaches in a minute. What you will find on page 29 is the Jack and Jess question. Now, there is a stem again above it, description about Jack and Jess. And what you've been asked to do is outline what's meant by social learning theory and then give this link with Jack and Jess's behaviour and how that's explained using social learning theory. I would really, at this stage, have a go at answering that question without looking at any notes. You should be able to, by now, given what we've just covered, have a really good overview of social learning theory and some of those key terms linked to the behaviour of Jack and of Jess. In a moment, and again, a really good practice for you to not move ahead on this one. In a moment, there will be a couple of slides with some ways of responding to that, but have a look at yourselves. See if you can have a go at that question before you have a look at a suggested response. Okay, so what do we got? 6 marks in total. First bit is the AO1 skill of our our knowledge, our background information, if you like. Social learning theory is learning through observation and imitating the behaviours that are rewarded. Modelling is a form of learning which a person performs that behaviour and another individual observes them. And it may be that children are more likely to identify with and learn from models who are similar to them, same sex, for example. Explain how social learning theory could explain Jack's behaviour and why Jess doesn't behave in the same way. Possible response, and obviously have a look at what you've got. It doesn't have to be word for word, but maybe in the right direction. It's likely that Jack identifies more strongly than Jess does with the violent role models on TV, most probably because most of these models are male, like Jack. As a result, he's more likely to internalise their behaviour and imitate it, especially if he expects the consequences to be rewarding, for example, praise from his peer. Jess, as a girl, is less likely to identify with the male violent models on TV. She does not imitate them because she does not anticipate any rewards associated with such violent behaviour. Lots of ideas in there. Doesn't have to be word for word, but maybe you've got some of those ideas to tie in with Jess and Jack and their behavioural explanation. Back to some commentary on evaluation. There's a further comment there about wider influences and things that go beyond social learning theory as an explanation for how we learn, and that then leading to a problem, what we call causation. So one factor causing another. Difficult to unpick that if there are other reasons for behaviour. And finally, and you'll see in your booklet on page 29 some views to tie in with some wider commentary. Issues and debates and approaches commentary is going to be really important as you move into year 2 of the course. And thinking of some of the topics that you might study over the 2 years that link nicely with this might provide some comments and research that would go with that IDA or issue, debate or approach. So aggression is a really clear example on that one. Mostly at this stage, and I'm sure lower school you've probably seen some reference to this, at the bottom of page 29 we've got what's called the nature-nurture debate. And this view of social learning theory clearly falls onto the nurture side of that debate, because the behaviourist view your development as a section, as a process of learning. So it is interaction with the environment. So a little bit of kind of commentary there. There are some wider issues which you're very welcome to have a look at, and some questions that go with that on page 30. Don't worry too much at this stage of year 1, very early on, to get stuck into reductionism and determinism as key IDAs or issues, debates, or in that respect, because really these are examples that we're going to be looking at over the 2 years, and with some details of research that explain the comment you're making. So don't worry too much, but you might like to make sure you've read through and maybe penciled some responses to the questions on page 30. Finally, there is some really good applications of social learning theory and changing behaviour. Here's a health application, and the idea that there's a value or a usefulness of this approach. So again, Anne Sanger is talking about the idea of anti-alcohol advertisements and the use of a sort of social learning theory approach there. And again, which shows us that this can be effective when changing behaviours. More recently with the COVID case, we've had the use of media, well-known media people to explain that. So you may be aware of some of the campaigns using people from the media to talk about COVID and some of the ways in which you can be safer about your own behaviour. Now, back to Bandura for a few moments. There is a link on page 28 to the key study, and this is an extension task which you could benefit from doing. The actual article itself can be clicked on and linked through that page 28 description, which you can see. There's also a PowerPoint that goes with this, and some key questions, and also to help you with that, some answers. So be careful, do have a look at the original article, but don't go overboard on the detail. Be selective and concise. It's a very useful study to know in lots of aspects for the course, but be careful that we don't get stuck in description of procedure more importantly, would be the findings, what it's telling us about social learning theory, and what commentary we might need to make. So, for example, ethics, or for example, aspects of validity, etc., of the study. But have a look at the extension task and the further PowerPoint. It's not voiced, but it goes alongside that with you. And as we draw to a conclusion, so what have we learned about social learning theory? Specification asks us to cover the key terms, so do make sure for each of those you can explain them in your own words. What do we mean when a person imitates? What do we mean when you identify, and who are you likely to identify with? What do we mean by modelling? And in terms of vicarious reinforcement, that this might be through others. So you might think of a boxing match where people can display aggressive behaviour, but in fact they're not being aggressive. The aggression is happening in the boxing ring. Then we acknowledge the role of cognition or thinking and those four mediational processes. You need to know and be able to describe each of those. And in terms of Bandura's research, it would be really useful to know something of both the procedure and the findings, but keep it relatively brief, as we said, and be prepared to maybe make some commentary about the value of that research. And that is the section on social learning theory. What you will find in your booklet are some further homework questions. Social learning theory applied on page 31. Again, a bit of a STEM question linking to cosmetic surgery. We've done at least 2 of those kinds of questions in this PowerPoint, so have a little look at that one for yourself. And there are some homework questions which your member of staff teacher may want you to do on page 31. Again, they're examples of exam questions, shorter answer questions, always worth having a go at. And even if you're not completing them in full or not required to hand them in, certainly useful to bullet point and have some ideas on how you would answer those questions. Thank you for listening.